November 12, 1968, 0347 hours. Dense jungle terrain, 15 kilometers northwest of Cu Chi, South Vietnam. Specialist Jake Mitchell, 19 years old from small-town Nebraska, crouched motionless behind a fallen mahogany tree, his M16A1 rifle slick with morning dew and his own sweat. The metallic taste of fear filled his mouth as he listened to the rhythmic crunch of sandaled feet moving through dried leaves, getting closer with each passing second. Around him, the suffocating humidity of the Vietnamese jungle pressed down like a wet blanket, carrying the earthy smell of rotting vegetation and something else he couldn't quite identify, the acrid scent of gunpowder residue that meant enemy forces had been active in this area recently. Mitchell had been separated from his squad during a botched night patrol 6 hours earlier when Viet Cong forces ambushed their reconnaissance mission near the notorious tunnels of Cu Chi. Now, as pale gray light began filtering through the triple canopy jungle, he could hear at least 8 different voices speaking in hushed Vietnamese, their words incomprehensible, but their intent crystal clear. They were hunting him, and they were getting closer. What happened next would become one of the most controversial and debated combat stories to emerge from the Vietnam War, a 20-second engagement that would challenge everything military tacticians thought they knew about individual survival under impossible odds. The Cu Chi district in 1968 represented one of the most dangerous operational areas for American forces in South Vietnam, a maze of underground tunnels, booby traps, and invisible enemy positions that had claimed hundreds of American lives throughout the war. The tunnel system itself stretched for over 200 kilometers underground, creating a subterranean city where Viet Cong fighters could disappear and reappear like ghosts, striking American patrols before vanishing back into their hidden world. Mitchell's unit, Bravo Company of the 25th Infantry Division, had been tasked with what military intelligence described as a routine reconnaissance patrol to identify suspected tunnel entrances and enemy supply routes in the area. Intelligence reports suggested moderate enemy presence, possibly 10 to 15 Viet Cong fighters operating from the underground network. The briefing had emphasized stealth over engagement, locate, observe, report back. No one expected the patrol to walk directly into a carefully orchestrated ambush involving over 40 enemy combatants who had been tracking American movements in the sector for weeks. Mitchell himself was a farm kid who had joined the Army 8 months earlier, driven more by small-town expectations than any burning desire to fight in Southeast Asia. His training at Fort Benning had been thorough but conventional, focusing on large unit tactics and established battlefield procedures that seemed almost quaint when applied to the guerrilla warfare reality of Vietnam. He had arrived in country just 6 weeks earlier, still adjusting to the oppressive heat, the constant threat of hidden enemies, and the psychological strain of fighting an enemy who could be anywhere or nowhere at any given moment. His squad leader, Sergeant Martinez, had been trying to teach him the survival skills that weren't covered in basic training: how to move silently through thick vegetation, how to read the subtle signs that indicated enemy presence, how to stay alive when standard military doctrine provided no clear answers. The ambush had begun at 147 hours the previous evening when the 8-man patrol was moving single file along what appeared to be an abandoned animal trail. The first indication of trouble came when Point Man Private Johnson suddenly raised his fist, the universal signal to halt and listen. For 30 seconds, the jungle had been absolutely silent. No insects, no bird calls, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Experienced soldiers knew that this kind of absolute silence meant human predators were nearby, causing all wildlife to flee or hide. Before anyone could react appropriately, the night exploded with muzzle flashes and the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles firing from concealed positions on 3 sides of the trail. The Viet Cong had positioned themselves in spider holes and behind specially camouflaged fighting positions that were invisible until they opened fire. Johnson went down immediately, hit multiple times before he could return fire. Sergeant Martinez was shouting commands that were barely audible over the incredible noise of automatic weapons fire, incoming rounds snapping through vegetation and thudding into tree trunks with wet, organic sounds that would haunt survivors for decades. The patrol scattered according to standard procedure, each man seeking individual cover while trying to maintain unit cohesion and return effective fire. Mitchell had dived behind what he thought was a fallen log, but turned out to be a carefully positioned piece of camouflage covering a shallow depression. By the time he realized his mistake and tried to relocate, enemy fire was so intense that movement meant certain death. He pressed himself as flat as possible and tried to become invisible, listening to his squad mates calling for help and returning fire from positions scattered throughout the immediate area. The firefight lasted approximately 18 minutes before American forces managed to break contact and withdraw to a predetermined rally point 500 meters south of the ambush site. When they conducted a head count, Mitchell was missing. If you want to discover how a 19-year-old farm kid survived the most intense 20 seconds of individual combat ever documented in the Vietnam War, please leave your like on this video. This helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next episodes. For the next 6 hours, Mitchell remained motionless in his improvised hiding position, listening to Viet Cong fighters moving through the area in organized search patterns. They were clearly looking for survivors, checking bodies, and securing equipment left behind during the chaotic firefight. He could hear them communicating with hand signals and whispered commands, occasionally stepping so close to his position that he could smell the fish sauce and rice wine on their breath. The psychological pressure was enormous. Every muscle in his body screamed for movement. His bladder was full, and several times he had to force himself not to cough or sneeze, despite the constant irritation from insects and decomposing organic matter. As dawn approached, he began to hope that the enemy search was concluding and that he might be able to escape during daylight hours when reduced visibility would make movement safer. Around 0300 hours, he heard American helicopters in the distance, probably a search and rescue mission looking for him. But the aircraft never came close enough for him to attempt signaling without revealing his position to nearby enemy forces. The helicopters eventually departed, leaving him completely alone in hostile territory with no communication equipment, limited ammunition, and no clear plan for escape. The weight of his rifle had seemed comforting during training exercises back in Georgia, but now it felt like an anchor dragging him toward his grave. Every metallic sound it made seemed amplified in the jungle silence, potentially announcing his location to enemy ears that he knew were still nearby, still listening, still hunting. The smell of wood smoke and cooking rice reached him around Darrow 30 hours, indicating that Viet Cong forces had established a temporary camp somewhere within a few hundred meters of his hiding spot. This was simultaneously good news and terrible news. Good because it suggested they weren't actively searching for him anymore. Terrible because it meant he was trapped in a very small area with a significant enemy presence that wasn't going anywhere soon. He could occasionally hear laughter and normal conversation, the sounds of men who believed they had successfully eliminated an American patrol and were now relaxing with a hot meal before moving on to their next objective. The temperature had dropped to around 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the early morning hours, which was actually cold enough to cause shivering when combined with his soaked clothing and the adrenaline crash that was beginning to set in after hours of peak alertness. He found himself thinking about his family's farm back in Nebraska, the smell of fresh corn in summer heat, the predictable rhythms of planting and harvest that seemed impossibly distant from this alien environment where every sound could indicate approaching death. His father had served in World War II and had told him stories about combat in Europe, but those stories had involved clear battle lines, identifiable enemies, and terrain that made sense to American tactical thinking. This jungle warfare was something entirely different, a chess game where the rules changed constantly and the enemy could appear from underground at any moment. Around 40 hours, Mitchell began to hear movement that was different from the casual sounds of the enemy camp. This was organized, deliberate movement in his direction, accompanied by the occasional whispered command in Vietnamese. They had decided to conduct one final sweep of the ambush area before departing, probably to ensure no American survivors were hiding nearby with radio equipment that could call in artillery strikes or air support on their position. He could identify at least 3 separate groups of 2 or 3 men each, moving in a coordinated pattern that would systematically check every possible hiding spot within a 200-meter radius of the original ambush site. The professional nature of their search technique told him these weren't local farmers forced into combat roles. These were experienced soldiers who understood small unit tactics and knew exactly what they were looking for. His heart rate increased to the point where he was concerned the sound of his pulse might actually be audible to approaching enemy fighters. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest enemy at this moment might be his own cardiovascular system, potentially betraying his location through biological functions completely outside his conscious control. The first Viet Cong fighter appeared in his field of view at 0346 hours, moving carefully through thick undergrowth about 30 meters away. AK-47 and held at ready position and eyes scanning methodically from left to right. Mitchell could see that the man was wearing the black cotton uniform and rubber sandals typical of Viet Cong fighters, but his equipment was well maintained and his movement suggested extensive combat experience. He was followed by a second fighter who positioned himself to provide covering fire, while the first man investigated potential hiding spots behind fallen trees and in natural depressions. Their coordination was flawless, indicating unit cohesion developed through months or years of combat operations together. Mitchell realized with growing certainty that he was about to be discovered, that his hiding position would inevitably be checked within the next few minutes, and that his survival now depended entirely on his ability to react faster and more accurately than men who had been fighting this kind of war for much longer than his 6 weeks in country. The mathematical reality was brutal. 9 men with automatic weapons versus one 19-year-old with 30 rounds of ammunition and no backup. His training had covered many combat scenarios, but none of them had involved single-handed engagement against overwhelming odds in dense jungle terrain where visibility was limited to a few meters in any direction. Do any of you have a grandfather, a father, an uncle who served and never talked about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing. Leave a comment right now saying just, "My grandfather served," or "My father served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your family, you're preserving memory for future generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comments. At 0347 hours, the lead enemy fighter stepped directly on the camouflage log that concealed Mitchell's position. The sudden pressure caused the rotten wood to crack with a sound like a gunshot in the jungle silence. Both men froze for a split second, the Vietnamese fighter looking down at the broken camouflage while Mitchell realized his cover was completely blown. Later, reconstruction of the engagement would determine that what happened next occurred in exactly 23 seconds, though Mitchell would always remember it as both an eternity and an instant, time stretching and compressing in the way that only extreme combat stress can create. The Viet Cong fighter was bringing his AK-47 to bear when Mitchell erupted from his hiding position, M16A1 already shouldered and sights aligned. His first 2 rounds took the lead fighter center mass before the man could complete his reaction, the impacts spinning him sideways into his partner who was attempting to raise his own weapon. Mitchell's muscle memory from hundreds of hours of marksmanship training took over completely, his conscious mind observing the action as if from outside his own body, while his hands and eyes operated according to programming developed through endless repetition at Fort Benning. The second fighter managed to get one wild burst off before Mitchell's next 3 rounds found their target, the AK-47 fire going high and to the right, due to the shooter's backward momentum as bullets struck him. The sound of gunfire immediately brought shouts from other positions throughout the area, and Mitchell could hear boots running through underbrush as additional enemy fighters moved to investigate the shooting. He rolled left behind a larger tree just as automatic weapons fire began chewing chunks of bark and wood from his previous position. From his new location, he could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions, indicating that he was now engaged with a much larger force than the initial 2-man search team. The smell of cordite and burned gunpowder filled his nostrils as he tried to calculate angles and distances, looking for opportunities to engage targets without exposing himself to crossfire from multiple directions. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, and he found himself thinking with an icy clarity that would have been impossible just minutes earlier when he was hiding in passive terror. A third enemy fighter appeared from behind a cluster of bamboo, moving in a flanking maneuver designed to catch Mitchell from his blind side. The man was young, probably Mitchell's age, and his approach was textbook perfect until he paused for 1 second too long to identify his target before firing. Mitchell's 4th and 5th rounds caught him in the chest and throat, dropping him immediately. The 6th and 7th rounds were fired at a muzzle flash approximately 40 meters away, where someone was providing covering fire for fighters trying to close distance. He couldn't confirm whether those rounds found their target, but the firing from that position stopped abruptly. Two more fighters appeared almost simultaneously from different directions, forcing Mitchell to engage multiple targets in rapid succession while constantly changing position to avoid incoming fire that was becoming increasingly accurate as enemy shooters adjusted to his location and movement patterns. His eighth and ninth rounds dropped another fighter who had gotten within 15 meters of his position, close enough that Mitchell could see the surprise on the man's face when bullets struck him. The remaining enemy fighters seemed to pause for a moment, perhaps reassessing the situation or waiting for additional support before continuing their assault. Mitchell used this brief lull to change magazines, his hands performing the reload automatically while his eyes continued scanning for threats. The jungle around him was now filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the metallic smell of blood, overlaid with the organic odors of disturbed earth and torn vegetation. He realized that his situation had fundamentally changed. Instead of being hunted, he had become the hunter, and the psychological advantage had shifted entirely in his favor, despite the numerical odds remaining heavily against him. The engagement concluded when the remaining Viet Cong fighters withdrew rather than continue pressing their attack against what they had apparently concluded was a larger American force than one isolated soldier. Mitchell remained in position for another 40 minutes, motionless and silent, before enemy voices faded completely from the area. When he finally moved to check the bodies of the fighters he had engaged, he confirmed 9 enemy killed in action, with personal equipment and documents that would later prove valuable for intelligence purposes. His ammunition count showed that he had fired exactly 19 rounds during the 23-second engagement, achieving a 47% hit rate under conditions that military marksmanship experts would later describe as impossible for sustained accuracy. The psychological impact of the engagement on surviving enemy fighters was evident in their complete withdrawal from an area they had previously controlled, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to disengage from what they perceived as a larger American force. Mitchell's extraction came 6 hours later when a helicopter search and rescue mission was able to establish radio contact with him using emergency frequencies. The pilot, Captain Rodriguez, would later report that Mitchell's voice on the radio was calm and professional, like he was reporting routine patrol activity instead of having just fought for his life against overwhelming odds. The helicopter crew expected to find a traumatized soldier in need of immediate medical evacuation, but Mitchell appeared at the landing zone carrying captured enemy weapons and intelligence materials, moving with the confident stride of a combat veteran despite having been in Vietnam for only 6 weeks. The weapon he handed to the crew chief was his M16A1, with 11 rounds remaining in his magazine, perfectly clean and maintained despite the jungle conditions and intense combat. His uniform showed evidence of the firefight, bullet holes, bloodstains, and the distinctive smell of cordite, but he himself appeared completely uninjured and psychologically stable. The immediate military investigation into the incident focused on Mitchell's ammunition expenditure and the physical evidence at the engagement site. Forensic examination of bullet impacts, blood trails, and equipment positioning confirmed his account of the 23-second engagement in detail. Ballistics experts were particularly interested in the shot groupings, which showed a level of accuracy under stress that exceeded expectations for soldiers with much more combat experience. The captured enemy equipment included 3 AK-47 rifles, 180 rounds of 7, 62 639mm ammunition, detailed maps of American patrol routes in the area, and personal documents that provided valuable intelligence about Viet Cong unit organization and supply networks. Enemy blood trails indicated that at least 2 additional fighters had been wounded during the engagement but had been evacuated by their comrades during the withdrawal. Military intelligence analysts concluded that Mitchell had single-handedly eliminated or incapacitated an entire enemy squad, fundamentally altering the tactical balance in that sector of operations. The psychological aspects of Mitchell's performance became a subject of intense study by Army behavioral specialists who were trying to understand how some soldiers thrived under extreme combat stress while others became paralyzed or ineffective. Dr. Sarah Chen, a military psychologist at Fort Bragg, would later write that Mitchell's case represented a perfect storm of factors that allowed an inexperienced soldier to perform at the level of a seasoned combat veteran. These factors included his rural background and familiarity with firearms, his physical condition and hand-eye coordination developed through years of farm work, and what she described as an unusual ability to compartmentalize emotional responses during crisis situations. The incident also highlighted the importance of muscle memory and repetitive training, as Mitchell's marksmanship performance under stress directly reflected the countless hours he had spent on shooting ranges during basic training and advanced individual training. The broader strategic implications of the engagement became apparent over the following weeks as Viet Cong activity in the Cu Chi sector decreased dramatically. Intelligence reports indicated that word of the incident had spread throughout enemy networks in the area, creating a psychological impact far beyond the immediate tactical results. Enemy fighters began avoiding areas where they might encounter isolated American soldiers, fundamentally altering their operational patterns and reducing their effectiveness against American patrols. The incident also contributed to American understanding of individual soldier capabilities under extreme stress, leading to modifications in training programs and tactical doctrine that would influence military operations for decades to come. After the war, Mitchell returned to Nebraska and resumed farming, rarely discussing his Vietnam experience with family or friends. He married his high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and lived what most people would consider an entirely normal civilian life for the next 52 years. His military decorations included the Silver Star for gallantry in action, the Purple Heart despite not being physically wounded, and the Combat Infantryman badge that marked him as a veteran of ground combat operations. He attended only one military reunion in 5 decades, telling a reporter in 1995 that he preferred to leave Vietnam in Vietnam and focus on the life he was building in peacetime America. His wife mentioned that he occasionally had nightmares during thunderstorms, when the sound of rain on their farmhouse roof apparently reminded him of gunfire in dense jungle. But these episodes became less frequent as years passed. The farm that Mitchell inherited from his father became one of the most successful agricultural operations in the county, known for innovative farming techniques, and consistently high crop yields. Local newspaper articles from the 1980s and 1990s describe him as a quiet, hard-working man who preferred actions to words, with no mention of his military service or the 23 seconds that had made him legendary within certain Army circles. His children learned about their father's combat experience only when they were adults, and even then, he provided only basic facts without emotional details or personal reflection on the events. He told his eldest son, Mark, that war teaches you to appreciate peaceful moments more than most people ever will, but refused to elaborate on what specific experiences had led to that perspective. The weapons and equipment that Mitchell captured during the engagement were retained by military intelligence for analysis and eventually ended up in the Army's collection of historical artifacts from the Vietnam War. The AK-47 rifles provided valuable information about Viet Cong supply networks and manufacturing sources, contributing to broader intelligence efforts to disrupt enemy logistics. More importantly, the tactical lessons learned from Mitchell's engagement were incorporated into training programs at infantry schools, where instructors used his case study to teach marksmanship under stress and individual survival techniques. Generations of American soldiers learned shooting fundamentals and combat psychology principles that were directly derived from Mitchell's 23-second fight for survival in the Vietnamese jungle. The location of the engagement, now part of a Vietnamese national park, is occasionally visited by American veterans returning to the places where they served. Park rangers report that every few years, older American men arrive asking directions to specific map coordinates in the Cu Chi area. Though most visitors are searching for locations where larger battles occurred, rather than sites of individual combat actions. The jungle has reclaimed most evidence of the 1968 engagement, but careful examination can still reveal fragments of equipment and subtle changes in vegetation patterns where the firefight disturbed the natural environment. Vietnamese tour guides sometimes tell stories about American soldiers who fought with unusual skill and determination, though specific details have evolved over 5 decades of retelling until they bear little resemblance to documented historical events. The lessons that emerge from Mitchell's story extend far beyond military applications, offering insights into human performance under extreme stress and the importance of preparation for unpredictable situations. His ability to remain calm and effective when facing overwhelming odds demonstrates the power of training and mental preparation, showing how repetitive practice can create automatic responses that function even when conscious thought becomes impossible. The incident also illustrates the importance of adaptability, as Mitchell succeeded by abandoning conventional tactics in favor of fluid movement and target prioritization that matched the immediate tactical situation rather than textbook doctrine. Perhaps most significantly, his story proves that courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite fear, transforming terror into focused action when survival depends on split-second decisions. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Each like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about farm kids who became legends in 23 seconds, soldiers who adapted and overcame impossible odds. People who discovered strength they never knew they had when everything was on the line. Real people, real courage. Leave a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, Germany. Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Jake Mitchell doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Educational note. This narrative combines documented tactical situations from the Vietnam War with dramatized elements for educational and entertainment purposes. While based on real combat conditions and verified military procedures from the era, specific characters and events are composite representations created to illustrate historical themes rather than exact historical records.